Welcome everybody to the fourth of the ESCoE COVID-19 webinars, in which we're discussing some of the many issues that arise for economic measurement during the pandemic. Today, we're delighted to have with us Professor Tom Crossley from the European University Institute. He's going to be talking about a new web survey carried out in the last few months and ways in which we might draw inference from such surveys. And Tom's going to talk for about 40 minutes. If you wish to raise points for clarification during the talk, please do this by typing in the Q&A box so that Tom can explain as he goes along. And after the talk, we'll have 15 to 20 minutes time for questions. If you have a question, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. And if you are then invited to speak, you will need to unmute your microphone, and I'd be grateful if you could mention your name and affiliation before asking your question. Also, please note that this seminar is being recorded. Okay, over to you, Tom.
Okay, thanks very much, Rebecca, and thank you all for coming and for the opportunity to speak to you about this project. This is joint work with a large number of collaborators, some of whom I've listed here on the front page, but of course that doesn't include everyone who's involved in this web survey, and it's really drawn on the expertise and efforts of a large part of the Understanding Society team, which is largely based at the University of Essex, but not entirely. So what I want to do today is first just give you a very quick introduction to what we've been doing, and then go into a little bit more detail about how we developed and designed this survey and implemented it. Then I want to talk briefly about population inferences. I mean, I think you know the purpose of this project is to try to get a handle on how the pandemic and the public policies associated with that the pandemic are affecting the UK population. And so it's really a situation where we're very, very concerned that we're getting accurate population inferences. And then I'll finish up by showing you some results from wave one of the web survey. Okay, so Understanding Society, those of you who don't know, is the UK household longitudinal study. It's a large panel survey. It's one of the largest in the world. It's the sister survey to things like the panel study of income dynamics in the US, or the socioeconomic panel in Germany. It was based initially on probability samples of the UK population. It attempts to interview study participants annually. And it's a mixed mode survey, meaning that we interview both face-to-face and via web mode. It started as entirely a face-to-face survey, but has transitioned since its inception in 2009 to being a mixed mode survey. So that's an existing study, a large, very large household panel survey that's been going on for more than 10 years, but it collects data annually, and content evolves very slowly. And so with the arrival of the pandemic and the associated economic crisis, we thought that it would be very, very important to get more rapid and more focused information from our participants. So from April of this year, participants in the main study have been asked to participate in short, frequent web interviews. And that's what I'm referring to today as the Understanding Society COVID-19 web survey. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So this web survey covers the changing impact of the pandemic on the welfare of UK individuals and households. It has core content, which is repeated. So we're at the moment we're surveying every month, and we may move to every second month. But there is core content that's repeated monthly. It captures change as the pandemic and policy responses evolve. But we also have variable content that responds to changes in the situation, as well as, and I think this is an important point, to researcher input. So we're trying to be a researcher-driven study, and I'll describe how we do that in a bit more detail. So as many of you will know, there are a lot of surveys in the field right now. Some of them are sort of one-shot cross-sectional surveys. Some of them are run by the ONS, of course. And some of them are run, on convenience samples. What do we think are the advantages of building a study like this off our main study? Why should we run a web panel off Understanding Society? And I think there are both content reasons and methodological reasons. So the content reasons are that the past waves of the main study provide important context for the responses. So when we see a respondent in our web survey, we have up to 10 years of prior information about them, about their labor force attachment, about their saving behavior, about their health trajectory, and we can bring that kind of contextual information into the analysis, we and all the researchers who will use these data. And I think the second content reason is that this is an annual study that's funded going forward, and so there will be future annual waves of this survey, of the main study, and those future waves will allow us to study long-run impacts. So the web survey tells us what's happening to people now. Future waves of the main study will tell us how what happened now plays out in 1 year, 2 years, hopefully 5 years, and 10 years. Okay, so I think those, from a content point of view, from an analysis point of view, those are important advantages to having some data collection in the context of a large panel survey. From a methodological point of view, I think there are a couple points. One is Understanding Society is derived from probability samples, which means we have a direct route to making population inferences. And I think that's valuable relative to some of the convenience samples or volunteer samples that are being run. The other thing is that, of course, any longitudinal study has attrition, but because we have been following these people for a long time, we have lots of detailed information about members of our study who do not respond to the web survey. So unusually, we have detailed information about both respondents and non-respondents. And that's, I think, a methodological advantage. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about the design, development, and implementation of this study. So first, going back to Understanding Society, the main study, as I've already alluded to, it follows the same people across time in the UK. It started with initial probability samples, and there are boost samples, which are also probability samples. And then we very carefully model non-response and attrition. So Peter Lin and his team derive inverse probability weights that carefully account for non-response and attrition over time. It began in 2009, but incorporates the BHPS sample, which goes back to 1991. So for a subset of our respondents, we have very, very long-run information, and in fact, in some cases, intergenerational information. At wave 11, which is the 2019, in field in 2019 and 2020, there are approximately 22,400 households in the study. So it's a very large study. The annual interview is about 40 minutes for all household members. So there are individual interviews. So in contrast with the example of the PSID, that it only has a single household respondent, we try to interview all adults. And then there's a 12-minute household interview. There's a self-completion questionnaire for 10 to 15-year-olds. We've been mixed mode from 2016, so we use face-to-face and web. In 2019, we were about 70% web first. So we have a procedure where people are allocated to an initial mode, and then if they don't respond in that mode, they're followed up in another mode. So you could be in the web, followed up by face-to-face or telephone. So we're about 70% web first in 2019. And we have core or priority areas for data collection. It's an omnibus survey, so we collect information across a wide range of content domains, but our priorities include employment, education, health, housing, income, social and family networks, and civic engagement. I just want to go over, and I think I'm setting up a contrast. I think that will be obvious, but I just want to go over what the timeline for a normal wave looks like. So a normal wave for us, we begin in the fall 2 years before we're going to go into the field at T-2. So if we were going into the field in January of 2020, we would, in the fall of 2018, we would agree priorities for content and redevelopment for the wave that would begin in, so that would be wave 12, beginning in January of 2020. Then in January of 2019, so at T-1, we begin content development work through the spring. There's consultation on the draft questionnaire in the summer, and it's turned over to the field agency for scripting in the fall. And finally, field work begins in, say, January 2020. So we've already been working on this. You know, our development time is longer than a year before we get to the field. And then once we're in the field for 28 and a half months. That's because we have 8 quarterly batches of participants that are issued to fieldwork. And each issued batch is in the field for 5.5 months. So they takes a little bit longer than the quarter to get all those people in as we chase up reluctant responders. That means that we get our final data in May of T+2. So for the wave 12, which is starting in January, which began in January of 2020, we get our final data in May of 2022. Then we spend the summer and autumn cleaning, checking, deriving weights, creating derived variables. And the data are released through the UK data service in November of T+2. So that'll be 2022 for wave 12. So from initial planning to data release for us is normally more than 4 years. Okay, so I just want to put that in context. So now turning to the COVID-19 web survey, this builds on an existing event-triggered data collection project that we had with Ipsos. So we had the idea that what we could do is we could check in by mobile or email with our participants on a regular basis to see if any idiosyncratic life events had occurred to them: job loss, pregnancy, change of household composition. And if they affirmed that such a thing had happened, we could follow up with a web survey. So we'd worked out the logistics of checking in with people and of inviting people to web surveys. And we were in the midst of that project when the pandemic came along. And so what we decided was we could also do event-triggered data collection for an aggregate event rather than an idiosyncratic event. So we decided to do event-triggered web data collection for COVID-19. So we asked all adult participants to answer a short 20-minute web survey on experiences during the pandemic. The first wave went into the field at the end of April. The second wave was in the field at the end of May. We'll be going this at the end of I think tomorrow, into the field for June. We have a planned survey for July, and then we're going to September. We've got 2 telephone follow-up surveys. So one of the concerns we have with a web survey is, not having our backup modes. So we've got telephone follow-up surveys planned. Well, we've done one, and we're planning a second to follow up people who are unable or unwilling to respond in web mode. And we've got planned mail surveys for youth, which mirror our youth mail survey that we do in the main stage. So what were the challenges in putting this into the field? Well, the obvious one was speed, right? There was no point doing this if it took 4 years. And in fact, there was a demand from both policymakers and researchers to have very, very rapid access to data. And so we aimed and succeeded in doing funding, obtaining funding, doing procurement, ethics, design, testing, and fielding in under 6 weeks. So that was our first challenge. And then we managed to turn around the data and release it in under a month. The second challenge was choosing content for a short survey. You could imagine that we were told by many, many people that many, many different things were essential content for our 20-minute survey. And finally, a further challenge is differential non-response. So, normally on a wave-on-wave retention understanding society is around 90%. As I'll describe in a bit more detail as we go along, we had a response rate of closer to 50% on wave 9. So the last fully complete wave of the main study is wave 9. So we look at responses to this survey as retention relative to wave 9, and we're getting about 50% retention. I'll come on to say some more about that. So those are the big challenges or some of the big challenges that we faced in doing that. Here again, to emphasize the timing, we started discussing doing this on the 13th of March. The stay-at-home order was on the 23rd of March. We sent out pre-notification letters on the 17th of April. We were in the field on the 24th of April. And we completed our first field work on the 30th of April, and then managed to release that data before the end of May. So this is very, very different from our usual, I usually say that understanding society is like a very big ship. It takes a long time to get anywhere, it takes a long time to turn. In this case, it was very different. So just to tell you again about the field work. So the wave 1 was in the field of the last week of April. We focused the content on health, including experience of coronavirus or coronavirus symptoms, but also on access to healthcare and health behaviors, also on economic impacts, and we had a focus on homeschooling. We sent the pre-notification letter to 42,000 sample members, of which only 33,000 had completed a wave 9 annual interview. And that becomes important for our weighting strategy in a way that, if time allows, I can speak about. So the overall response rate, if I include partial response, is about 41%, but among wave 9 respondents, the response rate was 46%, or 49% if I include partial respondents. We released data on the 29th of May. Anybody can download this data by registering with the UK Data Service. As of 21st of June, we have 326 downloads, 321, I think. So this was as of last week. Discrete projects have been registered. About half of those are by academics, but about a quarter of them are from government and the voluntary sector. We know, for example, that Treasury is using the data, as well as other government departments. So we've had enormous uptake of the data very, very rapidly. And the release included all the fieldwork documents, a user guide, an extensive user guide, weights to make the data population representative, derived variables, and also a child file. So the respondents to this are individual adults, but we asked individual adults about children of whom they were the parent or guardian and residing with. And then we asked questions about how those children were doing with homeschooling and what was happening to them. And then we converted that data into a file in which children are the unit of observation to facilitate analysis. So we got all of that out by the end of May. Wave 2 went into the field about contemporaneously with the release of the Wave 1 data. We had enhanced modules on economics and health, but new modules on housing and family. We managed to get it translated into Welsh for Wave 2, and we had 14,800 responses. That data will be released next week. One of the things that we've done along the way, which I think is an innovation, is we've had an open question call. So we opened it up to researchers and policy analysts and said, if there's content you think we should run, we provided a mechanism by which they could submit some suggestions through a web form. For the May questionnaire, we had 80 submissions. We had a further 36 submissions for the June call. And so far, we've been able to, including what's going into the field in June, we've been able to include about half of the suggestions that we received in full or in part. So sometimes we don't run everything that people suggest. Sometimes two people suggest versions of the same thing, and we run some combination of their suggestions. But so far, we've got about half of them into the field, and we'll be able to do more in July. So again, I just want to emphasize that we're a researcher-driven study. Questionnaire for Wave 3 was finalized last week. We'll be in the field, I hope, at the end of this week, and the data released at the end of July. We've also done a telephone survey where we focused on adults in households where no one is a regular internet user. Again, this shows the methodological advantages of building off an existing study because we know who's a regular internet user from past waves of the main survey. We fielded this at the end of the May with a version of the April web questionnaire. And it's largely capturing older respondents. So the unweighted average age of the web survey respondents is 48. The unweighted average age of the telephone survey respondents is 68. So this is helping us to complete our sample with older people who are much less likely to do a web survey. One thing that we didn't anticipate is that the telephone survey takes about twice as long as the web survey. And this, we haven't studied this in detail yet, but we think this has to do with the fact that we just have older people responding, and so, for example, they have more health conditions to tell us about, or it may just be that the mode is slower. That's something that we need to study in the future. So moving forward, after July, we're going to have web surveys every second month. We're going to resume accepting suggestions for question content, or continue accepting suggestions for question content. We're trying to get a short youth questionnaire focused on the strengths and the SDQ out by mail in July. So that would be to try to pick up 10 to 15-year-olds, with a longer youth questionnaire picking up return to school issues in September. And we'll do a second telephone follow-up survey in the autumn, mop-up survey in the autumn. Okay, so that's a description of what we did and what we are doing and how quickly we did it. So now I just want to say something about population inferences. Okay, so economists, and I'm an economist, often don't use survey weights, and they argue, the argument is that if your model is properly specified, then the weights don't help you and they may make your estimates less precise. And while I understand that argument and I have some sympathy with it, I think in the current situation where a lot of what we're doing in terms of research, and I mean not just we, but the broader research community or the community of users of these data are doing, are trying to just figure out what's happening. It's essentially, in some sense, descriptive, right? Who is suffering in terms of health, who is suffering economically, who is helped by public policies, and who is not. It's a lot of incidence work. And so, arguments for not being concerned with population representativeness and not using weights, I think, are untenable at the moment, or at least for this kind of research. And so we've been very, very concerned with population representativeness. I put that word in quotes because I'm not sure precisely what it means, but we are concerned with the ability to estimate population quantities accurately. So we think it's very important to start with probability samples. A probability sample is a sample in which every unit in the target population has a knowable non-zero probability of selection, and this contrasts with volunteer or convenience samples. Non-response and attrition mean that understanding society in every other real survey is not a pure probability sample. So we began with probability samples. Of course, the ONS works with different kinds of probability samples. But once you have non-response, it's not the case that the response probability of every unit is known. But what we do, and I again mentioned Peter Lin and his team, is very carefully modeling of non-response and attrition. And we continuously evaluate our ability to estimate the population quantities. So for example, our cross-sectional income data is continuously compared to the FRS and we compare our data to official data or official statistics wherever possible. And we're very confident that we continue to represent the UK population over time. So what do we think the advantages of starting from a probability sample are relative to, so for example, some of, we could have instead just gone to one of the pools of frequent web respondents that are maintained by the fieldwork agencies or by commercial marketing companies. So we think the one advantage of starting from a probability sample is that all types of the population are present initially. So, you know, in our initial probability samples, cover the whole UK population. In other words, we didn't have frame problems or coverage coverage problems, and that's not necessarily clear with convenience or volunteer samples. And I think the other big advantage is that we have detailed information on non-responders, and that's particularly true of attritters. So somebody who attritted between wave 9 of the main sample and wave 1 of the COVID web survey, between the wave 9 of the main study and wave 1 of the COVID web survey, we might have up to 11 years of information about that person. And that means we can estimate directly the probability of response given observables. We have very, very detailed observables. Okay, so X here is things that we can observe about both respondents and non-respondents. And for us, that's very, very detailed. On the other hand, if you run a convenience sample, you might know what the X's in your sample look like, but you only have information on respondents, and so you cannot estimate response probabilities and generate inverse probability weights directly. Instead, what you need to do is you need to back out an estimate of the response probability from the observed distribution of observables X, conditional on response, and some external source of information, the population distribution of X. So for example, what people sometimes do is they create weights by calibrating to totals from the labor force survey. And that's just less direct, less efficient, and typically uses much less rich specification of X, of the potential covariates of response. So we think that's a big advantage. So what do? So we model attrition. We model non-response to our web survey as attrition from wave 9 of the main survey. So our weighting strategy focuses on those members of our study who responded to wave 9 of the main study. And then we create inverse probability weights. And we do that by modeling the conditional probability of response to the COVID survey given response to wave 9 of the main survey. Okay. So we're estimating a discrete choice model. We're drawing on the very rich set of background characteristics we observe for both respondents and non-respondents to the COVID survey because we observe them at wave 9. We do variable selection via a lasso, a kind of machine learning procedure. And we do a lot of testing of our weights, which I'll come on to in a second. So we had 49% retention, which is very good for a voluntary web survey. And it's comparable to the response rates of many large surveys. You know, for example, the initial response rate to the LFS or the FRS, the Family Resource Survey or the Labor Force Survey. But it's much below the typical Understanding Society wave-on-wave retention rate. So the weighting here has more work to do than it does normally when we're correcting for attrition between waves of the main study. So one of the things we wanted to do is provide some testing of whether our weights were working. So what typically people will do is they'll show you means of, say, the weighted data versus some external benchmark. The problem with that, of course, is that external benchmarks are limited. Or it's also true that, particularly in the econometrics literature, there are many tests that have been proposed for non-random attrition, but most of those tests are for unweighted data. They're sort of testing whether the attrition is non-random. What we're interested in is whether our weights are able to correct for non-random attrition. And so we've done some testing that I'll describe now, which I think is new. So let y(t-1) be any variable that we're interested in. T-1 is the prior wave. So the prior wave, for example, would be wave 9. Here is wave 9 of the main study. Okay, so the point is, and then R, a T, is a dummy variable for response to wave T, which here is the COVID survey, and 0 otherwise. RT minus 1 is response to the prior wave. Okay. So then the point is that YT minus 1 is observed for both respondents and non-respondents at wave T, okay, because it's one wave back. Okay, so let wave T minus 1 be the wave T minus 1 weight. It's an inverse probability. And I convert that into weight shares. I just normalize by the total of the weights. It's just going to be convenient for notation. And let WT be the wave T weight. So this is the COVID weight that we've created, or the COVID survey weight. And it's the inverse of the response probability again. And as I mentioned before, it's constructed by multiplying the conditional probability of response to the COVID survey, conditional on response to wave 9 of the main survey, by the probability of response to the wave 9 of the main survey. Okay? And again, we can express that as a weight share. So here's the point. If both of these weights are correct in the sense that they are the expected value of response conditioned on Y and X, then the quantity in equation 1 has expectation 0. Okay, so let me see. Oops. Slightly too sensitive mouse, my apologies. Let me see if I can annotate. The way to think about that is that this is basically the average of that variable. Sorry, that should be a T minus 1. There's a typo there. I knew I would have one. This should be a minus 1. And I'll correct that in the slides. So basically the idea here is, suppose I wanted to know the mean of income at wave 9. There are, given both sets of weights, there are two ways I could do that. I could estimate the mean of income using COVID respondents and the COVID weights, or I could estimate the mean of income at wave 9, give it on the set of wave 9 respondents using the wave 9 weights. Okay? So I essentially have two estimators of the same quantity, both of which will be consistent under the, or unbiased under the null that the weights are correct. Okay? This one will be more efficient because it uses more data and less variable weights. But the difference between them is 0 and expectation under the null. So we can test the joint null with both sets of weights. So our pre-existing weights for wave 9 and our new weights for the COVID survey by just constructing the population analog of this object for different Ys, for different variables we might be interested in: income at wave 9, education at wave 9, poverty at wave 9, health conditions at wave 9, and testing whether this the sample analog of this construct is 0. Okay? And that's very easy to generate. It's just a moment test, and so it's very easy to generate a test statistic and conduct inference. So let me show you what that looks like. I hope. Gotta get out of here. Too sensitive. So there's an example of what it looks like. So these are the wave 9 weighted estimates. These are unweighted estimates from COVID. So this is using the COVID respondents to estimate wave 9 characteristics. So poverty at wave 9, benefit receipt at wave 9, arrears on housing payments at wave 9, being a smoker at wave 9, having a long-standing illness at wave 9. This is the wave 9 estimate using the wave 9 weights. So this is what we hope to recreate. These are the unweighted COVID survey using the COVID respondents without weights. And you can see that, for example, the COVID sample is not sufficiently poor or not sufficiently using receipt of benefits. And then if we use our inverse probability weight, you can see that we can come much closer to the wave 9 estimates for these wave 9 variables. And because we set this up as a moment, we can construct a test statistic and we can test for statistical differences. And you could see in most cases, these are all variables that are not in the weighting model. We are able to correct for selection into COVID response. The one that is not working here is smoker. We also did this just for comparison with a set of calibration weights, where we did what a lot of the convenience samples are doing, and just calibrated based on age, education, and gender. And you could see that those weights fail this test frequently and substantially. So we do a lot of this kind of testing now to try to make sure that the weights that we're generating to correct for attrition between wave 9 and wave 1 of the COVID survey work. Okay, I realize I'm getting a bit late, so I'm going to try to move on. One concern with the test that I just showed you is that we can only do that for things that are observed at t-1. We can only do that for income at wave 9 because we need to observe it for both COVID respondents and COVID non-respondents. That means the test that I just showed you has no power against a correlation of response with contemporaneous shocks, right? So if people are responding or not responding to the COVID survey because of changes in their income or employment or otherwise between wave 9 and the COVID survey, the test that I just described has no power to detect that. We can't do an updated version of the same test because we don't observe Y among non-respondents to the curve, YT, as opposed to YT-1, among non-respondents to the COVID survey. So what we try to do is implement a test which goes as follows. Suppose we had some variable ZT which we knew was uncorrelated with YT, but was correlated with response. Then we could test the weights with a weighted regression of YT on ZT. The idea is that if ZT, we know that in the population, a regression of YT on ZT should have a slope of 0 because ZT is uncorrelated with YT if we have such a variable. In the COVID response sample, it may be non-zero, and in particular, it will be non-zero if ZT is correlated with response. It's basically like ZT shows up in the Heckman sample selection correction. But then if we weight, right, under the assumptions that the weight is correct, and just as with the previous test, we should be able to estimate the population slope consistently. And so testing whether the coefficient on ZT is 0 in the response sample is a test of the weights. So this is what we tried to do. And our idea was to use for ZT a randomized aspect of the field work. So what we did is we randomized the time at which people were invited to join the survey. So everybody was invited on the same day, but they were invited in batches at different times of day, and we randomized that. So that generated something that's, by construction, uncorrelated with, for example, income at the time of the survey, because it was randomized, but potentially could be correlated with response probabilities. So that was our idea, but it failed because we failed to generate sufficient variation in response probabilities. Okay, so other methodological issues, let me just briefly say, one thing is that it turns out a very strong predictor of past response with marginal effect of 22% is past web response. So if you've ever done the main stage in web, you're much more likely to estimate a web survey for us, controlling for many other things. And the other thing is if we have an email address for you and we can invite you to the survey by email as opposed to by text message or by mail, by regular mail, you're much more likely to respond to this survey. So those are kind of important variables to have in our weighting model because they're variables that affect response, might be correlated with things like income that we're trying to model, but people typically wouldn't include in their model as a covariate. So they're very important variables to have in the weighting models, and in fact, we do have them in the weighting models. But I think it also gives us, I think, guidance for how to design data collection like this in the future. We sort of know which kinds of people and which kinds of situations, or we're learning which kinds of people and which kinds of situations will respond to a survey like this. And that helps us to, design incentives, design samples, and so on. I think another ongoing methodological issue is how do you best use data from the telephone survey. So I don't know, Rebecca, if I've got more time. If I have 5 more minutes, I'll just show a couple of pictures of the data.
Please do.
And open up for questions, just because I said that I would. So I'm just going to show you, lots of people are using these data. There are already papers out using this data by various people that we know. So if you're interested in the data, there are papers to go and read. But I'll just show you some things from the data so you can get a sense of what's possible. So what I'm going to show you is weighted analysis, of course. I've made a big deal about that. It's a sample of wave 9 respondents. So that follows immediately from it being weighted analysis. We generate weights through this multiplicative process of multiplying conditional probability of response times response at wave 9. And so we only do that for wave 9 respondents, aged 20 to 65. And we're looking at the subset of people who had a full response to the wave 1 survey. There are a few partial respondents. That's not really a big deal. And we're also looking at the set of people just to keep things consistent across tables and columns of tables that have complete hours in employment information at wave 1. Again, there's not very much item non-response, so that's not a very big deal. So here, for example, it's just a picture of employment changes for men and women. So one of the things we did in wave 1 is we asked people questions about a January, February baseline. So we asked them whether they were employed in January, February, because for some people the last full wave of the main study we had was some time ago, so we wanted to update that information. And then we asked them what they were doing at the time of the survey. And so the gray lines are employment, and the green bars are working strictly positive hours. And so, this is men with lower education, women with GCSE or lower, men and women with A levels, and men and women with degrees. And so the kind of thing that you can see in this picture is that as at the end of April, there was not much fall off in employment, but there was a lot of employment fall off in people working positive hours. So there are a lot of people who have not lost their job, but have stopped working. And so this would be, to do with the job retention scheme. You can also see that fall off in positive hours is much larger among low educated individuals than it is among people with degrees. So that would suggest that when the job retention scheme starts to be tapered, these lower education groups may be more at risk. Here's some more detail on labor market changes. I'm going to skip over that. Only to, one thing to point out is we see a lot more loss of employment. Among Black, Asian, minority, ethnic than among the white population. So that's potentially a concern. We also see, large drops in earnings for single parents. Of course, this is just earnings, not income, so that may have been picked up by the benefit system. This picture just shows the same things: employment, positive hours, weekly hours, mean weekly hours, and mean weekly earnings. So the same outcomes, again, February and April, so pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and then at the end of April. But what we're doing here is we're breaking people down by long-run income quintile. So what we're doing is we're looking at people's household income over past waves of the main survey, and dividing them into quintiles on that basis. So we're taking long-run average income. Okay, so this is just one example of the value of having the past waves of the main survey to pull in and provide context, because we can sort of look at what happens to people not only by their contemporaneous characteristics, but for example, whether they're sort of long run poor or long run affluent. Okay? And of course, there are many, many other things one could do, but I just wanted to show one example of using the contextual information from past waves. This is about why people had changes in hours. So this is just the subset of people who reported a decline in hours, and you can see, as we suggested, a great deal of that has to do with the furlough program. But there have been losses of hours among the self-employed. In April, the government support scheme for the self-employed was not yet operational. Some of the loss of hours is due to unemployment, but health and caring is some too, but much less important so far than the furlough scheme. But again, there are important differences here by different by characteristics, right? So we see, for example, much more unemployment in minority ethnic populations. We see a lot more loss of hours due to caring responsibilities among families with children. Some of this is to be expected, but the survey lets us quantify it. So I'm just going to skip over that. Oh, we also collected in the survey different what type of worker people are, basically what kind of contracts. So we could look at people with, these are essentially the 0 hours contracts. This row here, the fourth row. And you can see that, there's a lot more unemployment now with people with a 0 hour contract. We collected information on whether people had previously worked at home. So people who had previously worked at home sometimes are much less likely to be furloughed. So that's household earnings. I'm going to skip that. We collected information on how people were adjusting to a loss of labor market earnings. And so this graph shows different types of adjustment. On the left-hand panel, we have what we think of as sort of private self-insurance, using your savings, borrowing, asking for a mortgage holiday, or looking for new work. The right-hand panel, we have sort of external sources of insurance, including transfers for families and friends, a use of the benefit system, use of a food bank. So this is interesting, and this is by long-run income quintile. So in the long-run income quintile, a lot of people receive transfers, money or goods that they don't pay for from family or friends. We can see lots of people right across the income distribution using savings. New borrowing is higher at the bottom of the long-run income distribution than higher up the long-run income distribution. I think I'll show one last picture and then I'll stop because I know I've gone too long. This is arrears by long-run income quintile. So the gray bars are whether you're behind on any of your bills. So in any bills, the green bar, excluding housing, the green bars are whether you're behind on housing payments, so mortgage or rent. And again, we're looking by income quintile. So again, this is where having the past waves of the panel provides important context, because we look at how this changed relative to the incidence of arrears in 2017-18 when wave 9 was conducted. Okay, so you can see at the bottom of the income distribution, the incidence of people having arrears on bills other than housing has risen, although not statistically significant. At the top, we sort of see the reverse pattern. It's arrears on housing payments that have gone up. And this is something that will, someone should follow up, or us or someone else in future work, but we think this probably has something to do with, the ease of getting mortgage holidays versus getting rent holidays. At the bottom, it's hard to get a rent holiday. Higher up the income distribution, banks were giving out mortgage holidays. So I'm just going to skip to the very end. So just to summarize, we are running a frequent web survey tracking people over this year, which links back to 11 years of previous data and to future data collected by Understanding Society. We know the characteristics of those who responded and those who do not, and that supports making population inferences. And we have a range of content, but we're taking suggestions. We're carefully modeling attrition and testing for biases. And on substantive results, we see the losses right across the distribution, but not evenly. So this was an aggregate shock that affected people idiosyncratically. Economic losses, earning losses seem to be larger at the bottom of the long-run income distribution among single parents and among ethnic individuals, minority individuals. In terms of mitigation, it looks like the job retention scheme has had a large effect, but again, that seems to be uneven across different kinds of people. And there seems to be much early reliance on self-insurance. A lot of people using up their savings, a lot of people receiving transfers from family or friends to get through this difficult period. So we see that in the data. The wave 2 data will be out very shortly. Wave 3 is in the field, and so it will be important to track these things as we go along. And of course, anyone can download the data and do this analysis. Thank you very much. Those are my prepared remarks.
Thank you very much, Tom. So now we have a bit of time for some questions. I mean, I guess one observation on your talk here, the tests you're describing for attrition bias, presumably they could be used for many other surveys. For example, in the LFS, perhaps. I wonder whether you might want to comment on whether this methodology could be applied to some of these other surveys. And then I'd like to take a question from Peter Dalton and from Claudia Hupkau.
Okay, sure, thanks. So the tests that I described, actually both of the tests I described are completely general. They're tests for whether weights adequately deal with attrition. So for example, we could do this in the LFS, but they're, what you need to do is you need to observe something prior to non-response. So so if you think about initial non-response to the LFS, you can't really implement the test because you don't have much information on the frame. If you had linked administrative data, then you could do something. But if you thought about attrition across interviews in the LFS, then you could do exactly the same thing. It's basically a panel data test. So yes, the tests that were described, as far as I haven't seen the same test in the literature, as I said, in the econometrics literature, all the tests by Goshik or Moffat and other people are tests for, non-random attrition, possibly conditional on some X's in a model. Whereas this is a test for whether attrition, whether the weights adequately deal with attrition, which is slightly different, and it is general. Okay, so then I could take up Peter's question.
Hello, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic, nice talk, and it's a fantastic piece of work. I mean, I think congratulations to all the people involved, because I mean, to move so quickly in such, I mean, you're very modest in sort of describing it, but it must have been an amazing effort to get all that off the ground and actually, I mean, such a valuable data source. So I mean, I'm truly amazed.
Thank you.
So simple question first. I mean, so have you got any idea how many people have had COVID in wave 1 in the data?
So I saw your question. I thought, oh no, because I've been working on methods and I've been working on all the economic stuff, and I don't remember the number. So we do ask about who's had a test, and we do ask about who's had symptoms that they suspect were COVID. And if you go and look at the web page, if you just sort of Google understanding society COVID-19, there's a set of tables that were released with the data, and they're divided by economics, health, and homeschooling. And that information is in the first table on the health set of tables.
Okay.
And I'm really sorry that I don't remember. It's not a large number, but I I don't want to give you the wrong number. So
okay.
I'll email you the number afterwards.
Okay, I'll check it out. The other thing is, I mean, coming back to the point which is related to what Rebecca's just said, I think, I mean, this whole issue of awaiting and rewaiting and so on for non-response, I think is crucial. And what I'm wondering is, I mean, some of your description flashed by a little bit quickly to work it out. But if in some sense the attrition process or the non-response process from the normal survey is fundamentally different from, say, the non-response for the COVID survey. I mean, just thinking about it, if you're ill, for example, right. I mean, ill in a very specific way, or, I mean, I'm thinking about all that literature that's coming out at the moment about household production is disproportionately about the change in working lives and family lives for women rather than men, then you might expect that non-response would be quite different in this COVID survey than it was in the normal wave survey. And to what extent can you just infer or multiply up these inverse probability weights to take account of both, and how should we do that is quite a crucial question. And I can see why you're very interested in that.
Yeah. Okay, so I think if it's okay, I want to say two things about that. And it's kind of a good news, bad news. So the good news is, so one of the reasons that we construct weights in the way that we do, which is that we model, there's a model of wave 9 response to the main study. And then there's a model of COVID response conditional on wave 9 response. And we construct those models independently. So they, for example, use different variables, right? And so when I describe using the lasso procedure to choose a covariate set with which to predict response to wave to the COVID survey conditional on wave 9 response, that covariate set is not constrained in any way to be the same covariate set that we were using to predict response at wave 9 or at previous waves, right? So the modeling is entirely flexible in that sense. And so, if something like having a long-run health condition didn't matter very much for response probabilities in the past, but matters a lot now, we can pick that up. Your willingness to work with the web didn't matter very much in the past because we had a face-to-face option. Here we don't. So there are lots of reasons why the response process would be different, some to do with the nature of the survey, some to do with the nature of the times, and the models are completely unrestricted in that sense. That's the good news. Yeah. The bad news is that whenever you construct weights, you're using time t-1 information, right? Because you can only use things for weights that you observe for both respondents or non-respondents. So when you do initial non-response, whether we're talking about our data or the labor force survey, you can use information that's available on the sampling frame, you can use area information. And then as you go through a panel, you can use past waves information. But our modeling of non-response, we're modeling as a function of things we could see about you 2 years ago. Right, so long-run conditions, health conditions, we're going to pick that up. Whether you work in particular sectors of the economy that might be particularly hit, whether you're a man versus a woman, whether you have children or not, we can pick all those things up. But if non-response is related to contemporaneous shocks, that kind of a weighting strategy is not going to work. And that's always true, right? But it's just that, and I think this is what you're suggesting, Peter, is just at the moment, we might be particularly concerned that survey response is related to contemporaneous shocks. There are some pretty big contemporaneous shocks.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, just to reiterate, it's also about observables as against unobservables. And I know you're saying it's conditional unobservables on the previous period, but it's also, to what extent, I mean, literally unobservable of the balance of household activity has changed. Which we've seen a lot of anecdotal evidence of and opportunity surveys, but not really hard evidence about how it's fundamentally changed. And so that's an unobservable in the current time period. It exacerbates the problem to some extent.
Right. So then the thing I want to say about that is, I hope you can see that I've put slide 25 back up.
Yep.
This is my failed test, right? So this is exactly how this test was supposed to work, right? Suppose that what I'm concerned with, why is something I measure in the COVID survey? Suppose one of the things that we're measuring with the survey that's in the field right now is division of labor between partners, okay? The division of home responsibilities. Suppose that I was worried that that was related to response. Changes in that relative to pre-COVID were related to response. So the idea was to generate a random variable. Okay, so if I generate a random variable, then I know by construction that's uncorrelated with, say, the share of housework done by the female partner. And then but I make that random variable correlated by response because I use it to randomize some aspect of the fieldwork process. Then in an unweighted analysis, in the population, we would know that a regression of the share of housework done by the female member of the partner on that random variable Z should be 0. But in an unweighted analysis on the response sample, it would be non-zero because Z is correlated with response. And then we can test whether the weights take that back to 0. That was exactly the idea. And so it would, if we failed those tests, we would know that response was related to contemporaneous shocks and the weighting strategy was inadequate. So we're back to the drawing board with generating random variation in response rates. But if we can generate random variation in response rates, we think we have a way to test for exactly the problem that you're describing, Peter. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, that's a neat idea. I like it. I like it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have a question from Claudia Hupkow?
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. And I just want to reiterate what Peter just said. Great work, really, really important and great survey. So just a quick question on the response rate or retention rate, I think you called it. So for this COVID study, it was around 50%. If you looked at the people that were productive at wave 9, right? So I was just wondering, for wave 9, what would be the comparable figure? What was the sort of retention rate at wave 9? I dug out some figures. I found something at 86%. Is that correct?
Yeah. So typical wave-on-wave retention rates in Understanding Society are between 85 and 90%.
Okay.
So so 86 might be correct for wave 9.
That's what I found, yeah.
So the wave-on-wave retention rate here is much lower. That's one of the things I was saying on one of the earlier slides. And so I think that we have a bigger challenge than usual in getting the weights right in 3 senses, right? One is that normally the weights have to deal with a 15% attrition rate. Here they have to deal with a 50% attrition rate. And then secondly, we're, as Peter was pointing out, we're living in times where there are a lot of contemporaneous shocks, which is more challenging for inverse probability weighting, because inverse probability weighting is by necessity based on past observables. And so for both of those reasons, I think getting the weights right is much more challenging. But on the other hand, I would kind of like to be a glass half full guy, right? I mean, if you compare what we're doing to, say, calibration weights, which are the things that, a lot of the marketing companies or other people are doing web surveys through a commercial firm, they're just doing calibration weights on a small number of observable covariates, time invariant covariates. If we look at how well we're doing we're doing much, much better than with those kinds of weights.
Yeah. Yes, so, I actually compared sort of some baseline stats to the LFS, and this looks very much like what you get from LFS in the first quarter of 2020. So it looks good in a weighted sample. Just a quick follow-up. You said in May, did you do also telephone follow-ups? And do you expect to release a new version of the first wave, including those answers?
So if you're using the data, and it sounds like you have,
Yeah.
there will be a re-release of wave 1 next week, and it will not be the last re-release of wave 1. So in the last month, we've improved our weights. So the weights that you were using that look pretty good against the LFS, we think we've done better now. And so there are new weights, for example. It's also the case that we will incorporate the telephone data, but we have not done that yet. So there will probably be a further re-release of wave 1 with the telephone data incorporated, possibly at the end of next month. And so I'm conscious that as a researcher, the idea that the data are going to change over time is perhaps discomforting, but what I want you to think about is, it's like GDP, right? Everybody wants a quarterly GDP estimate really fast, and so what the ONS does is they produce one and then they revise it as they get more and more information.
Yeah, sure.
And we're sort of taking the same strategy, so the German socioeconomic panel is also in the also running a COVID survey. They were in the field slightly before us, and they're not releasing their data until August. We took the decision to release as fast as we could, but that means that we're going to probably have, just like GDP, we're going to have revisions.
Okay.
So there will be a revision out next week if you want to download that, and you need to check back for future revisions. There's an email list that you can sign up for to be notified.
Yeah, perfect. I don't know if I have time I had one more question, but maybe I'm not allowed. Can I ask?
Please.
Yeah. So just one of the most important topics we are looking at is obviously the effect on pupils of the school closures. And I was just wondering whether there are plans for a sort of faster NPD linkage, because currently the NPD linkage is only available for wave 1. And whether you're planning to update this at some point soon, and when it can be expected?
So data linkage to administrative data sources is one of our big priorities. I'm not involved with that one. And so I don't know what the latest status is. I could find out for you. If you sent me an email, I will find out what the status of that is.
Okay, so, fantastic, thanks.
Honestly, most of the delays, not always, but almost always, the delays on data linkage have to do with the data owners, not us. But the NPD, I can find out what's happening if you drop me an email. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
I'll email you. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think we have to draw this to a close. And thank you very much, Tom, for a very interesting and I think also very helpful to many talk. I'm sure I can say thanks on behalf of lots of us. And thank you for your questions as well. And I hope you'll be able to join us again in 2 weeks' time when Vasco Carvalho from the University of Cambridge, he will be talking about tracking the COVID-19 crisis with high-resolution transactions data. So see you then, I hope. And thank you again, Tom.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming.